Hey, Cypher here with another state rivalries. Thus far in this series, we've only talked about historical rivalries between states in the United States. But states can be political organizations of any size. So we're going international for this one. Mr. Beat is going to be talking about Pakistan versus India, while I'm doing a way older rivalry, going back by actually a millennium. And one of the rivals actually caused the rift between the two states that Mr. Beat is talking about. Yes, England versus France. The rivalry goes back horrendously long. And it was constantly bloody for more than half of it, with periods of peace lasting no longer than about 20 years. Even though they've been at peace with each other since the Entente Cordiale in the early 20th century, you'll still see blokes and mechs yelling at each other in the pub over rather silly stuff. And woo, do they like to taunt each other.
You are English types. Well, what are you then? I'm French. Why do you think I have this outrageous accent, you silly king?
Limeys might complain that the French are rude, or frogs might complain that Brits have no taste. But the rivalry goes way deeper than that. In fact, it goes deeper than Agincourt, which is what they'll often bring up as a historical instance. And if I'm perfectly frank, this is kind of too much to put into a single episode, so I'm going to split it up right at the 15th century, at the end of the 100 Years' War. While some histories of this rivalry like to start with the various Roman invasions of Britain, dating back to Caesar in the 1st century BC, that's pretty much unrelated to the current rivalry. No, that really starts with William the Conqueror in 1066 AD. He took the English throne by force, ravaged the countryside, killed 2 out of 3 of the other claimants, and eliminated the way Anglo-Saxon kings ascended. William was the Duke of Normandy, and therefore a vassal of the King of France. The various nobles below the King of France were constantly fighting among one another. William even fought the Bretons just west of the Normans only a few months before conquering England. Plus, William was the bastard descendant of a Viking named Rollo. So with that heady mix of reoccurring conflicts, William's new position as English monarch was heavily contested. But it was the Norman holdings in France itself that brought the two kingdoms to blows. Within a decade of conquest, border disputes flared up. Then, as soon as William died, his descendants fought over who would control what territory. These civil wars and interregnums often saw the King of France interfering to choose who to control Normandy, and in hopes of influencing England beginning in 1088. These minor Normandy versus English and French rivals blew up into the first open war between Norman kings and France. Henry I defeated Louis the Fat at the Battle of Bremoulet in 1119, which secured Anglo-Norman holdings in northern France. Well, that only lasted for 16 years, when Henry I died with no clear heir. So those regions fell into a couple decades of civil war simply known as the Anarchy. Once succession was nailed down again with Henry II in 1154, it was time for good old-fashioned coveting thy neighbor's holdings again.
Now to business!
Besides ruling England and the Duchy of Normandy, Henry was also the Count of Anjou and Maine, plus his wife was the Duchess of Aquitaine. But that wasn't enough for him. His ambitions set off the first in a series of wars known as the Capetian-Plantagenet rivalry. Well, with all of that, are you confused yet? Yeah, these medieval wars get really confusing. The fact is, the vast majority of people at the time didn't give a damn about whatever the nobility was doing, and that's important to keep in mind. Feudalism is haphazard and not rigidly enforced in its power structure. Peasants would have been hard-pressed to name who the hell was king, or really anything beyond their specific fiefdom.
I'm your king! Well, I didn't vote for you!
And if I explained every war, this video would take hours, so I'm necessarily skipping a lot here, just to get to what really matters today. But the specifics mattered to the Plantagenet kings of England. Plantagenet refers to several dynasties of English monarchs, starting with the Angevins.
Angevin.
Henry II expanded enough to rival the Capetian dynasty in France. Henry fought a rebellion from his heir, who died too early anyways.
And as for you, young Henry III, here's my royal foot up your royal buttocks!
Then some disputes with the clergyman Thomas Becket, and eventually he fought his remaining sons, who were allied with Philip Augustus of France. Oh boy, a lot of fighting there. Well, Richard the Lionheart took the throne a couple years later.
Oh boy, now it's my turn.
No, King. That's just who you're named after.
Well, off to the Crusades then. I've got a laser pointer named Saladin to defeat. Away!
Well, yeah, that's what Richard actually did. The tithe he levied to pay for his crusading against Saladin caused some folks to hate him in England, so his brother John attempted a revolt with the help of Philip Augustus. So Richard went to war with France to keep the Angevin lands, and succeeded only to promptly die, leaving the lands to John anyways. And in the process of John taking power, a bunch of Angevin lands were taken by Philip Augustus of France. Oops. Another war broke out when the French invaded again in 1213, taking more Angevin lands in France. Well, John wasn't popular either, setting off a baronial revolt. And wouldn't you guess it? The French helped the barons. John died during this, but the Magna Carta was made, and then the barons turned on the French king. So the French claimed the English throne too, but that failed. They kept fighting smaller wars for half a century, mostly over territory in France. Basically just border conflicts and raids. The biggest attempt was the Saintonge War, but that was simply a defeat of the English who tried to retake some land. It led to another baronial revolt in England, which led to King Edward I ceding even more land to France. The final of these was in 1294. Some minor naval disagreements brought on further invasions in France, it kept escalating for years, and at the same time England fought a series of wars against Scotland. You see, Edward I and later II tried to take control of Scotland for themselves, but with the help of France, the Scots fought off the English in a series of wars now called the Wars of Scottish Independence. The old alliance between France and Scotland brought France and England into direct conflict. That war lasted till 1303, where France acknowledged Gascony was still an English possession, Edward I proclaimed he was a vassal of Philip IV of France, and the French princess married Prince Edward II. The territories were sold, Scotland was an English-only war again, and the two kingdoms were interrelated directly. What could go wrong?
No, now go away or I shall taunt you a second time.
Well, only the longest war in French and British history, of course. A small war in 1324 between France and England over land bordering Gascony led to a French victory. It tarnished Edward II's reputation badly. After having already fought a baronial revolt a couple years prior, the same people rose up again, and in some complicated happenings, Queen Isabella, Edward II's wife, invaded England with a French-backed army, took control, and placed her son on the English throne as Edward III. You see, Edward III had been sent by his father to pay homage to Charles IV, but he later showed independence from his deposed father by refusing to pay homage any further. Philip VI officially confiscated 2 domains of Edward's in 1337. Instead of accepting that he had to pay homage, Edward laid claim to the throne of France itself. So Philip invaded Gascony a year later, kicking off the 100 Years' War. By its very title, you can guess this is far too complex to cover in detail. But you can see with all this fighting before 1337, it wasn't something new and different. In effect, France and England were already warring for 2 centuries before the start of it. Even the so-called 100 Years' War was really 3 separate wars, with a bunch of intrigues and expeditions in between. The first of these 3 was Edward III versus Philip VI over territory and homage. Various vassals claimed loyalty to one king or the other, and even some other countries, including more trouble with Scotland. It was so protracted that John the Good ascended as French king in the middle of a pause in hostilities because of the Black Death. By 1360, the English were the clear victors with the signing of the Treaty of Bretagne.
It's pronounced Bretagne.
Oh hey, it's Barris from This Is Barris, a YouTube channel that specializes in French history. Alright, so let me take another crack at it. Sounds like... Britannia?
Merde, these damn Americans are half as dumb as the English.
Yeah, my pronunciation is never that great, and French is just weird.
Omelette de fromage.
It's their fault that we can't spell anything in English, because of all the loan words that we got after 1066. Realize the English nobility mostly spoke French even into the 14th century, so the 100 Years' War was kind of just a civil war. Anyways, 1360 was the height of English power, with a bunch of new territory and no requirement to pay homage. Edward III renounced his claim to the French throne, held John the Good captive till his death, and everything was fine. For only 9 years. After helping Peter the Cruel regain the Castilian throne, the Black Prince raised taxes in Gascony. Peasants revolted and asked for help from Charles V of France. The whole mess with paying homage and revoking land repeated itself, but this time in favor of France. Still, this phase took another couple of decades, and Charles suffered from a few bouts of madness before a truce was signed in 1389. This time, the English lost a bunch of land. Even though peace was technically between the two kingdoms, a series of rebellions and civil wars saw both France and England meddling in each other's affairs to help overthrow each other. Henry V finally managed to calm down his realm and decided to invade France again to resume the old war in 1415. Even though disease decimated his forces, while he was withdrawing, the French attacked at Agincourt. Those who did not fight there on St. Crispin's Day held their manhoods cheap, for it was an overwhelming English victory. The Burgundians and the Armagnacs had been fighting each other over French succession since the end of the last war, and they divided over alliances with Anglo invaders. Henry V made significant conquests and took most of northern France, and even took back Gascony. To cement the whole thing, he secured a marriage with Charles VI's daughter over the Dauphin, who swore to uphold their progeny's succession in 1420. So yay, the English won the 100 Years' War! Well, actually, we've got another 30 years to go. And the war with Henry V was only ended with Charles's forces, but the forces loyal to the Dauphin continued fighting. 2 years later, both Charles VI and Henry V died within a couple of months of each other. Though Henry V left his infant son Henry VI to be crowned King of England, and then later King of France, the Dauphin, Charles VII, claimed the French throne despite the fact that England held more of France than him. It was a bleak time for the Armagnac faction, but an English siege of the city of Orleans brought forth a peasant girl named Joan. She claimed to be a messenger of God. Joan of Arc inspired a resurgence of French hope, first with lifting the siege, then with continuing to support Charles VII over Henry VI. The Burgundians captured Joan of Arc and sent her to the English, who burned her at the stake as a heretic. But that didn't help change the tide of the war, which kept giving the French more and more victories. So the Burgundians deserted their English allies for the Armagnac Charles VII. Together, they fought hard for another decade and a half, leaving no territory for the English except for a small northern strip of land called Calais. The French won the 100 Years' War in 1453, and the English monarchy was in shambles. Now this might all seem pretty focused on just England and France, but the 100 Years' War has some larger connotations, which Mr. Beat is going to clue us into.
Thanks, Cypher. So why does the 100 Years' War matter to anyone outside of France and England? Well, because the rest of the world would eventually have to deal with those two states. A big legacy of the war was the dramatic rise of militarization in both. In the decades following the war, the two still hated each other and were constantly preparing for the next war. Everything in English and French society revolved around the military. Eventually, this led to both states becoming pretty darn good at being able to kick butt in any future war with anybody. And being at war so long also meant a shift of the balance of power between the monarchy, aristocracy, and representative assemblies in both states. The monarchy gained power and the aristocracy lost it, and feudalism further declined. The 100 Years' War also led to impactful military innovations like missile weapons and the introduction of gunpowder artillery. But most importantly, war was now fully a countrywide business, and other countries had to follow suit. In both England and France, the 100 Years' War brought on a much bigger sense of patriotism. And this sort of Cold War between the two states led to other countries kind of being forced to have to pick a side, and contributed to both continually gaining power after this war, as Cypher will explain later.
Mr. Beat is covering Pakistan versus India in his episode today, so be sure to go check that out.
Now this episode is already running pretty long, so I'm stopping right here and continuing right where I left off in the next one. So be sure to subscribe to see what's next, although it might take a week or two before I can get to editing everything. I'm teaching and taking comprehensive exams this year, so this is what happens.